I'm always interested in what the critics of Sam Harris have to say. No one is likely to tell me something that I am not aware of about Harris. However, I highly value their perspective, and it helps me check my own critique and observations of Harris. So when Ben Affleck went after Harris, it made for good television, but it also gave great exposure to the issue of religious criticism, which is an important subject to me and to Harris, and I believe to the world. So I, for one, was delighted to see someone like Ben Affleck taking a passionate interest in the subject. Clearly Harris was prepared for anything that day, but I was not. Reza Aslan, a graduate of Harvard Divinity School with a big-ass chip on his shoulder, coiled up and ready to lambaste Harris with a carefully crafted hyperbole after the fact and after the show. Apparently this has been going on for some time, but I really haven't noticed. Reza Aslan is a well-spoken intellectual elite who is clearly well-informed and knowledgeable about the issues and facts. Reza summarizes his displeasure with Sam Harris as follows in his Salon interview. Sam Harris, to me, gives atheism a bad name because he comes from a tradition of atheism that is really disconnected from the titans of intellectual, philosophical atheism who gave birth to the modern world. These were experts in religion who, from a position of expertise, criticized religion. Sam Harris is a neuroscientist. He knows as much about religion as I do about neuroscience. The difference is, I don't go around writing books about neuroscience. I had to read that a couple of times and then checked his other writing to realize he was serious. You really think we have to study 18th century thinkers to understand the effects of religion today? Apparently he does. In all fairness to Reza, he is not a racist or religious bigot. He is, however, a perfect example of an elitist bigot. This is simply bigotry from authority. If you have a point, make it. I don't really care how you discovered it. What I care about is how you know it's true. Now, it is undoubtedly true that Harris does not frame his arguments in the classical style of Aristotle. So Harris clearly writes and speaks with the accent of a neuroscientist, and this, according to Reza, is supposed to be grounds to reject his reasoning, which of course is utter bullshit. I only wish Richard Feynman were around so he could fit the reality of the O-ring around his neck. I mean this metaphorically, of course. After any particularly juicy elitist bigotry, I think it's important to point out the inability of elitist bigots to get it right in the first place. I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers. Thomas Watson, chairman of IBM, 1943. Radio has no future. Heavier than air flying machines are impossible. X-rays will be proven to be a hoax. William Thomas Lloyd Kelvin, British scientist, 1899. Reza feels Harris does not understand the basic premise, and I quote, "After all, Scripture is meaningless without interpretation." If Reza believes this is literally true, he is delusional. Holy text is not a tabula rasa, not anything goes. The whole point of religious text is to create consistency of the practitioner. If Reza's proposition were literally true of language, we would have no way to communicate. Information theory is not a religious concept, it's a scientific one. I suggest Reza read a little more outside of the ancient philosophers before he makes claims about the nature of communication, which clearly he has not considered, which Harris clearly has considered. After Harris noticed this tweet in a professional context from Reza Aslan and then from Glenn GreenWald, Harris went on the attack, this time accusing both Glenn and Reza of defamation of character. I prefer character assassination because it's more visceral and seems more accurate. It may not be a legal term, but fucking lawyers ruin everything anyway, so who really cares? Clearly, GreenWald is a spiteful, vindictive bastard. I once asked Harris to apologize to him because I thought he had a valid point. I'm sorry I did. Even if his point was valid, because his lack of character and common decency, it would have been misconstrued and perverted in any case. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that Glenn and Reza are willing participants in the distortion of reality to describe and discredit Sam Harris. I encourage you to read Harris's simple article about this issue on his blog that I'll have linked in the low bar. Harris, in spite of his faults, is surely trying to have an intelligent conversation about religion and politics. And GreenWald and Reza simply want to discredit him in any way that they can. The profiling trope. One of the more annoying tropes about Sam Harris is the profiling trope. It's annoying because it's not going to go away, because it's true. But it's not true in the way it is often presented. Now, Harris probably is wrong on this issue, but it's not for the reason you might think. He has a tactical blind spot. And I don't mean that in the sense that he should have said nothing at all. I mean it in the sense that when he was talking about the issue with Bruce Sininger, he literally could not understand why a strategy that works in Israel will not work in the United States. In my satirical blog post about the issue, I compare it to chess and checkers. Bruce's arguments were not as blunt, but they were just as effective in explaining the problem. And Sam simply did not think that it was that important of a distinction. So in the end, Sam's arguments on profiling is purely a technical one and has nothing to do with bigotry and has everything to do with efficiency and effectiveness. And to even suggest that it has anything to do with bigotry is an extreme distortion of what he was saying. So when anyone drops this trope about Harris, I have to roll my eyes because clearly they don't understand his position, or they do, and they're playing politics. Of course, this is classical political pandering, and it is to be expected from people that have a political agenda and want someone out of the way, and labeling them a bigot is a good way to do it. By Glenn GreenWald's and Reza's actions, it is clear they see Harris as getting way too much attention, and they can't have a free thinker like Harris just politically ignorant enough to ask the obvious hard questions and not savvy enough to keep his mouth shut. It seems clear to me that Glenn and Reza want to keep the conversation about political issues as simple as possible. We can see this in Glenn GreenWald's privacy speech at TED, and we can see this in Reza's interviews and writings. They are both trying to hide complexity by keeping their arguments simple. For example, GreenWald only gives two examples in his privacy speech: privacy or transparency. Either we have it or we don't. In the case of Reza, he is overgeneralizing scriptural interpretation when he says all readings of Scripture are interpretive. If this is true, then everything is political and cultural, and GreenWald and Reza are happy. There's a lot of truth in both of these ideas. The problem is, your rocket ships don't fly in the real world, where details are critical to preventing your rockets from blowing up. Just because it sounds pretty doesn't mean it's dealing with reality. The bottom line is, Reza and Glenn don't want a real conversation. They just want Sam out of the way, so they don't have to have that conversation. So they can be free to sell the overly simplified versions of reality to anyone just gullible enough to buy into it. If they really cared about the issues, they would want to have a reasoned and rational conversation with Sam Harris. He continues to offer, and they continue to call him a bigot instead of having that discussion. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of simplicity, so I don't fault GreenWald and Reza for wanting to keep the conversation pointed at the most relevant facts. But that is not what they are doing. They are in fact simply pointing at the conversation at the most politically desirable. In a simplified metaphorical sense, all Harris is saying is smoking is bad for you and causes cancer. Chain smoking is worse and causes more cancer. These are empirical statements. We can test the validity of the claim. We can also question the validity of its context. But what we should not do is question Harris for asking the question in the first place, or to presuppose he has a hidden agenda by calling him an Islamophobe. If you want to attack Harris by saying the direct approach will only shut down dialogue, as they did on TYT, you are making a valid point. Essentially, what GreenWald and Reza are trying to say is that he does not have the right or authority to ask these questions. The only advice I have for Sam and those who understand the predicament that Sam Harris is in is to play the long game and to keep the facts in focus. This is not about Sam Harris. This is about being able to have rational discussions about the problems that we face in the world. I defend Sam Harris not because he is without flaws, but because he wants to have reasoned conversation and not politically charged ones. And those are the type of conversations we need to get in the habit of having. We need to unwrap our egos from being right and rewrap our egos in getting it right. What works is what matters, not what work we get. We need to stand up to the arrogant elite and say, no, that is not the kind of conversation we want to have. No, you will not be allowed to get away with a character assassination because it suits your political or ideological agenda, and it lets you buy the next model of the Tesla. You will either learn these rules or you will be made irrelevant. The democracy of the internet will not look kindly upon your arrogant asses. The time of the elite is drawing to a close, and in a few short decades you will learn what accountability means. Nothing like a meaningless threat to get your point across. Thanks for listening. It means a lot to me. I defend Sam Harris not because he is without flaws, but because he wants to have reasoned conversation and not politically charged ones. And those are the type of conversations we need to get in the habit of having. We need to unwrap our egos from being right and rewrap our egos in getting it right. What works is what matters, not what work we get. We need to stand up to the arrogant elite and say, no, that is not the kind of conversation we want to have. No, you will not be allowed to get away with a character assassination because it suits your political or ideological agenda, and it lets you buy the next model of the Tesla. You will either learn these rules or you will be made irrelevant. The democracy of the internet will not look kindly upon your arrogant asses. The time of the elite is drawing to a close, and in a few short decades you will learn what accountability means. Nothing like a meaningless threat to get your point across. Thanks for listening. It means a lot to me.